go away. On January 1st of this year, my friend Carly, who's an art teacher in the Denver area, wrote on her blog about her New Year's resolution. 2019 was the year I got my first iPhone, she writes. It made my day-to-day operations undeniably more efficient. And it does lots of nifty things, which I discovered slowly, mostly by accident. Most recently, I happened upon the screen time statistics. And holy expletive, that was the scariest mirror I've ever looked into. According to whatever widget measures my scrolling, I was averaging 4 hours of screen time a day. 4 hours of screen time a day. How could that be? I'm the teacher who vehemently lectures my students about the dangers of spending too much time looking at screens. I read all the articles and news reports on the brain science behind digital engagement compulsively on my phone. Apparently, among other things, for 4 hours a day. Carly then reflects on the deleterious effects of social media on herself and others, writing, "Those 4 hours a day add up, as well as subtract from my creative output and personal and spiritual growth. I'm wasting my time and consequently wasting my life, vast chunks of it anyway, on absolutely nothing of value. And it's not just me. Lately, when eating at restaurants or sitting at stoplights or waiting in line anywhere, I take time to observe the craned necks and mechanically scrolling thumbs of the humans around me. And I'm telling you, this addiction doesn't discriminate. People of all ages, races, and social standings are glued to their screens everywhere they go, every chance they get. Everybody's on their phone, everywhere, all the time." She therefore concludes, "For me, and maybe you, it's time to replace a preposterous amount of time I waste on my phone with things I know deep down I was meant to be using that time for. It's time for me to sit with the big questions that crop up when I'm not distracting myself with a screen. It's time to get the hell off my phone." Well, I confess that as I read Carly's resolution, I was both convicted and conflicted. I'm convicted by, well, the resoluteness of her resolution. If digital culture is impeding human flourishing, then maybe the right thing to do is simply to hang up. As good Anabaptist Mennonites, we can boldly claim H. Richard Niebuhr's Christ against culture type and just be done with it. Christ against digital culture could be our new mantra, could print it on t-shirts. And yet, I'm conflicted because, as Carly herself acknowledges, digital culture is often extremely useful for my ministry. I'm what ministry folks are now calling a co-vocational pastor. It's a word I picked up from our president, formerly known as bivocational, which means that in addition to the work I do here at the seminary, I spend roughly half my week pastoring a small church in South Bend. And this limited time I have pastoring presents me with a dilemma with respect to digital culture. The dilemma is this: digital culture seems both essential for and inimical to effective ministry. Without engaging in digital culture, how am I supposed to keep up with what my congregants are going through? Much of which they only share through social media posts or tweets. How am I supposed to keep up with the latest ministry trends or learn what issues fellow pastors are wrestling with in their respective ministries? How am I supposed to keep up with the looming political, social, economic, and environmental issues that the church must engage as part of our public witness? And yet, every minute spent engaging digital culture is a minute not spent on embodied face-to-face ministry. So what's one to do? Well, on Monday night, Melinda began her talk by sharing the task that Jewel had assigned to her. to speak to the theological, ecclesial, relational, and practical questions we might consider as we both participate in and resist digital culture, to offer theological reflection on how we might engage digital culture constructively, and to model a process or processes for communal theological reflection that might be used in local congregational contexts. And to accomplish these tasks, you may recall Melinda had us reflect on the relationships among orthodoxy, right thinking, orthopraxis, right acting, and orthopathy, right feeling. In so doing, she gently chided her Anabaptist Mennonite community for often jumping straight to orthopraxis, to the neglect of orthodoxy, and especially orthopathy. Well, as my assignment for this closing session, however, Jewel asked me to speak on orthopraxis. My task then for this session, Jewel explained, is to reflect on how you as a teacher, thought leader, and pastor engage digital culture. How do you make decisions about what to engage and when? What are some of your discernment practices around this and the principles guiding them? What are some practical considerations? Now, I suspect Jewel asked me to address these questions not just because I'm a pastor, but also because among AMBS faculty, I'm the closest thing we have to a millennial. I'm actually part of the Oregon Trail generation, for the record. Yeah, Oregon Trail. What's that? I actually don't play Oregon Trail. I'm just a part of the generation that grew up with it. In 7th grade, we had the free version on our computers at school, but I would just kill all the elk and deer before I got out of Indiana, and then my trip would be over, so I never made it to Oregon. I was a little more violent back then. So the thought is that as a millennial, I must be particularly savvy with digital culture. But as it turns out, I'm one of those friends that Andy anonymously referred to yesterday who, until 2 weeks ago, never owned a smartphone. I begrudgingly upgraded to a smartphone only after the screen on my slider phone of many years quite literally burn out. I know, it was a sad moment, little LG. But it was as though my phone itself was joining the growing chorus of friends telling me, dude, it's time to move on. Well, even after Jewel learned about my phone, she persisted. Melinda will provide the theological foundation, she explained. We'd like you to focus on the practical considerations. Now, as an adult convert to Anabaptism, I'm more than happy to talk about orthopraxis. I appreciate Melinda's cautions to Anabaptists about neglecting orthopathy and jumping straight to orthopraxis. But at the same time, the Anabaptist Mennonite emphasis on putting faith into practice is precisely what drew me into the fold in the first place. At its best, Anabaptist practice flows naturally from Anabaptist theology, which includes both right thinking and right feeling. But when I began preparing for this talk, I ran into a different kind of dilemma. I knew my talk was intended to provide the praxis to complement Melinda's theology, but I didn't know at the time what theological reflections Melinda would be giving us. So I had to supply the theology myself by asking, WWMT, what would Melinda think? For answers, I turned to the book, A Table of Sharing, where Melinda has an essay titled, Extending the Theological Table, MCC's World Community Cookbooks as Organic Theology. There, Melinda reflects on the writings of dietitian and lay theologian Doris Jansen Lonergan, to develop a more with less theology. Many in this room are likely familiar with her 1976 More with Less cookbook, which went on to sell nearly 1 million copies over multiple printings and editions after Herald Press was initially skeptical and only ran 1,000. This cookbook not only provided global Mennonite recipes, but also called a generation of Anabaptists to connect their theology of simplicity with their food purchasing and eating habits. Barry describes Lonergan's form of theologizing as organic or homegrown theology. As opposed to conventional systematic theology that aims for doctrinal clarity and purity, Barry describes organic theologizing as a kind of God talk that emerges from the living, breathing, organic grassroots of a faith community. The purpose of organic theology and homegrown God talk, Barry writes, is to help communities take stock of their shared experiences and consider what kind of fruit they're producing, rather than viewing church as a place where we shop for unblemished fruits and vegetables plucked from the produce aisles without getting our hands dirty. At the same time, Barry writes that organic theology contributes to the theology and ethics of simple living, a social movement that connects the politics of daily living with the concern for authentic connection with other people rather than things. In other words, more with less theology emerges organically from the tradition from which Lonergan writes, while also challenging those within the tradition to take stock of their practices and politics in light of that tradition. As Lonergan writes in the introduction to the More with Less cookbook, we're always looking for ways to live more simply and joyfully, ways that grow out of our tradition but take their shape from living faith and the demands of our hungry world. As Barry describes, More with Less theology presents us with the option of a lifestyle based on simplicity and freedom compared to the enslaving forces of materialism and overconsumption. Or again, in Lonergan's words, simplicity is not a restriction, sacrifice, or denial. It's an emancipation. We're back to more with less. So what might such a more with less theology and practice look like with respect to digital culture? How can we draw from the organic theology of our Anabaptist faith to assess the practices we've developed around digital culture? In what follows, I want to present a seemingly counterintuitive proposal. I believe we can look to the ways of our Anabaptist siblings in the Amish tradition as they engage new technologies to develop new ways for us to engage digital culture. But before turning to the Amish, I want to take a brief theological detour to North Africa. In his book On Christian Doctrine, 4th century bishop and arch nemesis to many first-year Mennonite seminarians, St. Augustine provides a helpful distinction between uti and frui, or use and enjoyment. Augustine writes, there are some things which are to be enjoyed, others which are to be used, others still which are to be enjoyed and used. That little space in the middle of the Venn diagram there. He continues, those things which are objects of enjoyment make us happy. Those things which are objects of use assist and, so to speak, support us in our efforts after happiness, so that we can attain the things that make us happy and rest in them. Augustine asks us to imagine being wanderers in a far-off country who realize that we can't be happy so far from our homeland. And after deciding that we need to return home, we then have to settle on a mode of transportation to get there. But once we've decided on our mode of transportation, let's imagine by sailboat, we become drawn into the pleasures of sailing. Augustine writes that by turning things which we ought to use into objects of enjoyment, we become unwilling to hasten the end of our journey and become engrossed in a factitious delight. Our thoughts are diverted from that home whose delights would make us truly happy. For Augustine, God alone is the ultimate source of all enjoyment. Everything in the created order, then, is an object of use. And he spends significant time in On Christian Doctrine, Book 1, discussing whether fellow humans, as creatures made in the image of God, are properly objects of use or objects of enjoyment. And interpretations vary on how to understand Augustine on this point, but it seems to me that he lands on humans as both objects of use and enjoyment. And however Augustine scholars want to decide that, centuries later, the Enlightenment philosopher Immanuel Kant settled the matter with his version of the categorical imperative known as the formula for humanity. He writes, "So act that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end, and never merely as a means." Kant imagines a hypothetical kingdom of ends, a society where each human is treated as an end or object of enjoyment rather than merely as a means or object of use. If we follow Augustine and Kant in finding our ultimate enjoyment in God and fellow humans, or even just Jesus' formulation of the greatest commandments as loving God and neighbor, then where does that leave us with respect to digital culture? I propose that we treat digital culture with an inverse categorical imperative, which we might call the formula for technology. So act that you treat technology always as a means to an end and never as an end in itself. Technology in general, and digital culture in particular, is not an object of enjoyment, but is at best merely a tool to be used to love God and neighbor. The problem with digital technology in particular is that it's designed to be treated as an object of enjoyment. It's only profitable to the extent that it can monetize our attention. And so it's designed not just to capture, but to monopolize our attention. Its ability to create addiction for users is not a design flaw, but is by design. This means that if we're going to engage digital culture as a means rather than an end in itself, we're going to have to do so with intentionality. And here's precisely where we can learn from the organic theology of our Amish faith siblings. As MIT-trained computer scientist Cal Newport describes in his recent book, Digital Minimalism, at the core of Amish philosophy regarding technology is the following trade-off. The Amish prioritize the benefits generated by acting intentionally about technology over the benefits lost from the technologies they decide not to use. Their gamble is that intention trumps convenience, and this is a bet that seems to be paying off. So in developing our organic theology of digital culture from the practices of the Amish, then, we can identify 5 roots, the first of which is intentionality. Discussions of technology never accept a new form of technology as a given. Technology has to prove its worth in order to be adopted. Approaching all new technologies with intentionality can lead to uses of technology that differ from mainstream culture. So, for example, many Amish communities prohibit the ownership of automobiles, but don't prohibit hiring a driver to transport them via automobile. Many Amish communities prohibit having a phone in the home, but don't prohibit having a phone at the end of the drive. Many Amish communities prohibit being hooked up to the electrical grid, but don't prohibit the use of generators or solar panels. In his article, Technological Prudence, What the Amish Can Teach Us, communications professor Kevin Miller writes that the Amish's selective use of technology can seem maddeningly inconsistent to outsiders. But, he observes, there's a logic behind it, and one that makes increasing sense to modern Americans as we grapple with our relationship to technology and its hegemonic tendency in our lives. Whatever the apparent inconsistencies, the Amish have managed to keep technology in check. And in doing so, they fostered a sense of community that many of us yearn for in our electronically tethered and frenetically paced lives. Miller writes that the Amish's discussions around technology adoption are guided by the ultimate interest in keeping sacrosanct the form of community the Amish see as mandated in Scripture and which has been handed down to the present from their European Anabaptist forebears of the 16th century. Some folks you may have heard about. In other words, the Amish begin their discernment around technology by clarifying their ends and then work backward to consider whether and how a given piece of technology might serve as a means to those ends. Miller discusses the Amish's selective use of the telephone as a case in point, writing, "A plastic rather than rigid posture toward innovations allowed Amish groups to successfully leverage the telephone as a tool for maintaining community, rather than ripping its fabric apart." And so a second root in our organic Amish theology of technology is this: theological and moral discernment. Discussions of technology begin by clarifying the ends of the community. Before you even turn to the technology itself, ask what are the ends that this technology might aid us in achieving. Steve Nolt writes in his article, "You Hold the Whole World in Your Hand, Cell Phones and Discernment in Amish Churches." He writes, "As a consumer community, the Amish believe that moral discernment comes first and that power arrangements, batteries for clocks, naphtha gas for lamps, propane for refrigerators, and so on, can follow later for those things deemed worthwhile." And so once the theological and moral discernment about ends is in view, the Amish then have considerable latitude and variety in discerning how a given technology might serve as a means to those ends. Karen Johnson Weiner describes in her article, Technological Diversity and Cultural Change Among Contemporary Amish Groups, that technology itself is not a threat to the Amish. Rather, technology is an outcome of a particular decision that favors one way of life over another. Amish communities are making different choices about technology and about how to be Amish in an increasingly technological world. Amish discussions around technology aren't first and foremost about the technology itself, but are about a way of life, what it means to be faithfully Amish or Anabaptist or Christian or human. As Newport describes, the Amish, it turns out, do something that's both shockingly radical and simple in our age of impulsive and complicated consumerism. They start with the things they value most, then work backward to ask whether a given new technology performs more harm than good with respect to these values. And these observations lead us to our third root of organic Amish theology: practical means-ends discernment. Discussions of technology clarify how a new technology can be used as a means to achieving the ends of the community. But even if a new technology is deemed useful as a means to a community's ends, that doesn't automatically justify adopting the technology. There's a higher bar the technology must pass. As Donald Cramer and Snell describe in their chapter, Taming the Powers of Technology, although they selectively use new technology, the Amish worry that its use may erode communal life. A given instrument or mechanical device, while harmless in itself, might trigger broader social consequences. The production value of a new piece of technology is often weighed against its potential impact on the traditional patterns of work and community. Their cautious use of technology hinges on an implicit assessment of its long-term impact on community life. And so, in addition to the practical discernment of means and ends, the Amish engage in another kind of practical discernment around costs and benefits, the fourth root of their organic theology. Discussions of technology clarify how the benefits of a given technology justify taking on the cost of adopting it. It isn't enough for a new technology to be useful as a means to an end. It isn't enough for it to provide some identifiable benefit or another. Rather, it has to be able to provide a benefit without also costing the community something that it values. As Craybill and Nolt observe, technology that improves efficiency or reduces physical labor is generally accepted if it doesn't compromise basic social arrangements. And then finally, if a given technology has identifiable use as a means to an end, and if the benefits justify taking on the costs of adopting the technology, there's still one remaining root to organic Amish theology of technology. And that's what I'm calling technological discernment. Discussions of technology seek to identify ways to modify, adapt, or selectively appropriate a new technology to receive its benefits while minimizing its costs. This fifth discernment practice requires the Amish to be more tech savvy than the average tech adopter. It takes technological know-how and innovation to take a new technology and modify it to bend towards your desired ends instead of the desired ends of the developer. Being countercultural when it comes to technology need not mean being anti-technology. As Nolt writes, Amish descent from the mechanical mainstream is not a straightforward all-or-nothing proposition. Instead, it reflects complex patterns of discernment that have produced neither a flight from technology nor an uncritical equation of new and improved. Well, Kevin Miller cautions that it's important in Amish and technology discussions to avoid falling into the common false dichotomy, to either romanticize as ideal or dismiss as hopelessly compromised. Instead, he proposes asking what we might learn from the Amish and their attempts to control technology, and then recontextualize those principles for our habitus. So as we conclude our time together, allow me to share some ways that I've begun to recontextualize these Amish practices for engagement with digital culture in my pastoral ministry. My hunch is that one of the reasons for our Mennonite anxiety around digital culture is that we sense that it can be really useful for ministry. But then we're frustrated by the way it often becomes an end in itself. And so instead of thinking of digital culture in the abstract, I propose that we think instead of new digital communication tools in the concrete. So let's remove this monolith around all our little social media apps there. Instead of asking what Christ's relationship is to digital culture, what if we simply asked how platforms like Facebook or Twitter do or don't contribute to human flourishing, or to flourishing ministries in this case? Drawing nourishment from our organic Amish roots, we can begin to discern whether and in what ways any particular digital communication tool is or isn't useful to achieve our ministry ends. Approaching digital communication tools with intentionality means we don't accept any particular tool, not even Facebook, as a given. Each tool has to pass a high bar in order to be adopted. Again, in his book, Digital Minimalism, Cal Newport recommends taking a 30-day digital declutter in order to begin this process of discernment. He recommends that during this 30-day period, you stop using all the digital communication tools that you can without jeopardizing your employment. But this isn't just a social media fast or a New Year's resolution to hang up your phone. It's a time to begin a process of discernment over which tools are actually beneficial as a means to your desired ends, and how best to use them or not use them to achieve those ends. Well, I have to confess that I stumbled upon Newport's book through a recommendation of a Facebook friend whom I've never met in real life. It was the first book of 2020 that the editor of Inglewood Review of Books, Chris Smith, read and recommended. And I just read my friend Carly's blog about her New Year's resolution. I was kind of feeling like I should do something similar. And then I was wasting time on Facebook while I thought about it. And I saw Smith's post about this book, so I quickly grabbed a library copy and read it. And on Newport's suggestion, then I underwent a 30-day digital declutter over most of January and into February of this year. The two primary social media platforms I regularly utilize for ministry are Facebook and Twitter. So these are the two main platforms I gave up. I was showing my PowerPoint to my 10-year-old son last night, and he was like, "Those are all old people apps." So I don't know what the kids are using these days. I'm Oregon Trail, but Facebook and Twitter is what I use. So Karen can maybe help fill us in on that. But after doing this digital declutter, the next root of our organic Amish theology is taking inventory of your ends. And so while the ultimate ends of every Christian are to love God and neighbor, I focused on the penultimate ends of maintaining effective pastoral ministry. I identified 7 ends of ministry, and then when I presented this on Monday in our leadership clinic, folks from the clinic offered 3 more suggestions to this list. And as a seminary-trained preacher, I, of course, had to use alliteration for this list. So my 10-point sermon here are my 10 P's of effective pastoral ministry. Thanks for groaning, because I actually never do 3-point sermons or alliteration in my preaching, but here we go. So the first P of effective pastoral ministry is pastoral care. Effective pastoral ministry involves, perhaps first and foremost, caring for congregants or parishioners. The second is proclamation. Pastors proclaim the gospel in their context. Third is pedagogy. Not only do pastors preach the gospel, they also teach their congregation how to understand the gospel and its implications for their lives. Fourth is prophetic speech. While the primary audience of proclamation is the congregation, pastors also have a responsibility to speak truth to power, including the powerful within their congregations. Fifth, which was added on Monday, is prayer and piety. Pastors have a responsibility to cultivate their own spiritual life in order to both minister from a place of orthopathy and to provide an example for the congregation to emulate. Related to the fifth is a sixth, personal enrichment. Here I, of course, don't mean financially. It's nice as that would be. But rather, I mean tending to one's own emotional, physical, and relational well-being in addition to one's spiritual well-being. In a similar vein is seventh, professional development. This is why we all came to Pastors and Leaders, Deep Faith, and continue to rely on the CLC for all of our needs. You see the value in continuing to grow and develop in the profession of ministry, to learn new ideas and practices that keep your ministry fresh and relevant. Well, turning from ways to develop as a pastor and leader, the last three focus on various kinds of ministry relationships. So the eighth is what I'm calling parishioner engagement. And so in addition to caring for particular needs of specific congregants or parishioners, pastors need to regularly communicate with the congregation to ensure that everyone is kept updated on the activities of the church, that they're on for volunteering in the children's ministry on Sunday, and so on. At the same time, the church needs to be outward-facing, which means it also needs to have some kind of public promotion. This need not always be as lofty as evangelism and outreach ministry, though it might include that. But at minimum, it simply means keeping the community or neighborhood where the church is located apprised of the activities of the church so they can consider whether they want to join in. And then finally, 10th is developing partnerships for the church. Partnerships with other churches and ministries, nonprofits, social justice organizations, local governments, schools, and so on. With everyone here in the room, we could probably come up with a few more items to add to our list of the ends of effective ministry, though we may be running short on our supply of words that start with P at this point. But I would say that if your ministry regularly involves tending to the 10 items listed here, there's a good chance you're on the right track. But once we've identified these ends of ministry, we can then return to examine each of these digital communication tools to assess its usefulness in achieving those ends. And so for each tool, we can ask the various questions of discernment. And here I'm going to talk about Facebook, although I think a slide dropped out, so we'll get to this in a minute. So questions for discernment are going from what I talked about earlier from the Amish roots. After identifying the ends, then we talk about whether this particular tool can be a means to those ends. And if so, how? And then for practical cost-benefit discernment, we can ask whether the benefits of adopting this tool justify taking on its costs. And if we decide that a particular tool is useful and beneficial, we move to the mode of technological discernment, asking whether there are ways to modify, adapt, or selectively appropriate this tool in order to maximize its benefits while minimizing its cost. So personally and in conversation with my church staff, I came to discern that Facebook and Twitter can actually be useful and beneficial toward achieving ministry ends. But we recognize they also do present significant costs. Not only can they be a time waster, they also facilitate the illusion of having achieved ministry ends when the reality only distantly approximated those ends. And so instead of providing actual pastoral care, you just have to click a heart or thumbs up or sad face emoji on a congregant's latest post. Instead of actually speaking truth to power, you rage tweet about the latest outrage of 45 and his administration. These minimal quotients of online pastoral activity make you feel like you're performing your pastoral duties when in reality you're shirking them. So how can these tools be modified in order to be maximally useful and minimally detrimental? And here we'll turn to my example of Facebook. How many people are on Facebook? Okay, so good. This is a good one to talk about. So I'm going to briefly conclude here with 5 modifications I've made, which have helped me out a bit. There's other things you could do, but take this for what it's worth. So first, and the most significant modification I did was I unfollowed everyone. Notice I didn't notice I didn't say I unfriended everyone. There's a distinction. So you can be a friend with someone without following them. In fact, others don't even know whether you follow them unless you tell them. So now all of my Facebook friends here know that I've unfollowed you. And what this does is it completely eliminates that unfiltered feed that normally appears when you sign into Facebook. So you sign on to do a task, and then you're met with this stream of posts by good friends, old friends, acquaintances you met at a conference once, their cousin that befriended you for some reason. And you just start scrolling through that until you forget why you signed on in the first place. I found that this feed is the biggest time waster. It's the same thing on Twitter, and I unfollowed everyone on Twitter too, but that actually lets them know that you've unfollowed them, and so I got some upset people that took offense at that, so heads up on Twitter if you do that. But instead of following people and scrolling through the unfiltered feed, secondly, I've created friends lists and groups. So if you are a close friend of mine or a congregant or a work friend, you're in one of my lists now. I have a list for my church, a list for AMBS. There may be more to come. But friends lists are a little known tool you have to kind of search for, but it allows you to organize your friends into categories. And when you click on a friend list, you can see a feed then of only your friends on that list. And so in 2 minutes, I can sign on, see what my congregants are sharing, and determine whether there's anything I need to follow up on pastorally. Or work friends at AMBS, I guess, as well. This leads to a third modification recommended by Newport. Don't boo at me, but don't like posts. Stop liking posts or loving them or crying over them. When you remove the ability to provide the minimum quotient of empathy to your congregants, it forces you to find other, more meaningful ways to engage with them. I'm telling you, friends, the bar has been set so low by social media that even a personal email or text, to say nothing of a phone call, card, or personal visit, conveys that you care in ways that a like or a sad face emoji never will. My 2 final modifications may be even more contested, but they worked for me. Fourth, I only post new information rather than my own social commentary. This still allows me to keep congregants and friends up to speed on the church's happenings and what's going on in my life. But again, it removes that temptation to use social media as a substitute for prophetic speech. Now, if there's something burning on my heart, I have to determine whether it rises to the level of writing a long-form blog post, op-ed for the local paper, article for a periodical, and so on. If not, then it's probably something that my spouse and I can complain about over coffee in the morning. If so, then I have to put in the work to say something meaningful and substantive enough for a venue beyond social media. But then if I do write something that's published somewhere or another, even on my blog, it becomes a new piece of information that I then can share on social media without violating my policy. And usually a shared link carries more weight than a regular Facebook post or tweet anyway. And then fifth and finally, aside from only sharing new information, I now use Facebook only, or I should say primarily, to gather information and not to communicate. So when I log in, I can quickly see if any of my congregants has a birthday that day, for example. And if so, then rather than adding to the chorus of friends posting pithy messages on their Facebook wall, I take a few minutes to write them an email or give them a phone call. It still works as a phone. If you see that a congregant's grandpa has passed away, rather than adding a sad emoji or comment to the post, make a note to try to attend the viewing or the funeral, or at least to check in with the congregant in person. Now, I know these all may seem like fairly small adjustments in the grand scheme of things, but in just the past month or so since I've implemented them, I've already noticed that I engage social media much less, but with much greater intentionality. And doing so gives me more time for ministry and makes me more attentive to the needs of my congregation. In short, I found what the Amish and Doris Sloniger and Melinda Berry have taught us rings true when it comes to digital culture. Really can get more with less. Thanks.